Hello, strangelings, and welcome back to my parlor. So today I lost all my natural lighting to show you how pale I am, but I wanted to talk about what it means to be white. Because of the fact that Thanksgiving was 2 weeks ago, I mentioned the fact that I usually tell my kids about the first Thanksgiving and then also about the spring after. Because I feel like it's important, even if I don't identify as Native American, which I don't have any genetics from any tribe. I have family from the Cherokee tribe, but no genetics. He was the grandfather of my cousin who tried to claim that we weren't related, despite the fact that I told him how his grandfather got into the family. He told me I was absolutely correct, and then I told him, well, that's what my grandfather told me, and yeah, that was from his family. So yes, we're family. So, yeah. I don't have any Native American in me, as far as genetics go, because that was a great uncle, someone else's parent, grandparent, great grandparent, whatever. However, I was one of those kids who could not understand why we gave an altered version of what actually happened. I mean, I understand you don't want to teach the kids that the same Native American tribe in the event that inspired Thanksgiving, the same Native American tribe who chose to help these pioneers to ensure that they survived the winter, to help show them what they didn't know was food around them, to help them understand how to make the soil work better for the food that they brought to plant, then was served with a massacre that spring. Of course, you don't necessarily want to tell the children that. Not when they're small. But you still want to be honest about what happened. You don't want children growing up thinking, oh, well, those Native Americans, they had a party the next spring, right? To celebrate that they got through the winter. Well, no. No. They got killed by soldiers that next spring. To celebrate how the white man thought that they deserved the land that they landed on, even if people were already there, because they were savages. And I really feel like doing this video is really important right now, with all of these people who are online talking about how upset they are about white culture behavior. It's an upsetting behavior. And today I'm going to illuminate why. Because you see, until somewhere in the 90s, white was considered to mean Caucasian. That specifically means people from the Caucasus. These are people who, when other tribes were growing and thriving around them, they decided, this is an example from Mesopotamia, 700 plus years ago. I'm sorry, 7,000 plus years ago. 5,000 years before the birth of the person people believe to be the Christ. Yeah, we're not going to get into that today. Y'all know I'm not religious. Y'all know there's reasons. If I need to talk about why I say believed the Christ today, it's going to take forever. So, These people, 7,000 years ago, chose fear over understanding, chose fear over empathy, chose fear over love. Most tribes, there were scattered handfuls of tribes around the world, maybe not even quite a handful of tribes, but a few who had the same kind of mentality. This wasn't just suddenly cropped up in the Caucasians. There are still other tribes to this day that are separate from the rest of the world who have this kind of mentality. But most of the tribes that were growing and thriving at the time still hung on to the belief that women were gods. They believed women were gods because they did not understand the miracle of birth, so of course they believed that the women just would suddenly decide to create another life. Hence, they were gods. Now, of course, there were many tribes that were starting to understand that there was an act that males were doing with the females before they decided to start brewing this child. And in many of those tribes, women were revered at least as equals, if not a bit higher then. Unfortunately, Caucasians were making laws that decided that women, in fact, had nothing remotely to do with the miracle of birth. This thinking was the birthplace of the Roman idea that, in fact, it's men that create life, because inside male testicles are miniature versions of humans just swimming around in there, literally. Literally, guys, that's what they thought. And that when males have sex with females, one of the humans will crawl into the female, lodge itself in her organs, and start to grow. In fact, I personally have found texts of doctors of the day. I definitely question their actual knowledge, trust me. I do. Who actually had stated that on the autopsy of this woman who had died, they discovered an organ that was unnecessary. They were not talking about the pancreas, guys. They thought that the uterus was an organ that spewed toxin into the female body, causing it to die at a certain point. It is why we still have a persistent myth that menopause is essentially the start of the death of a woman, when in fact, menopause isn't even technically really fully the middle of a woman's life. It's not. Women, genetically, are not made for babies to be our end-all be-all. We're not made with just enough time to raise the last of our babies. No. In fact, we are supposed to live so much longer than our fertile lifespan. Of course, that's far from the only thing that we found now that we've finally, in the years 2020 on, have finally started to actually study the female body and the male reproductive system. Because both of these were studied for so long. But I digress. So, because they feared why women were giving birth, how women were able to just give birth. They decided, instead of trying to understand and engaging in a bit of empathy with their fellow human, they decided en masse that instead this must be controlled, because if they're really that powerful of beings, well then they certainly can't understand how to control themselves, because how could they? We couldn't control ourselves, so how could they control themselves if they have pardon me guys, all this ability? I'm not drinking enough water, I'm sorry. It's a old habit. I come from a highly moist air location, so to come out to a dry air desert, 10 years on, I'm still having problems remembering to hydrate myself enough. Anyhow, and not only did they fear the fact that they didn't understand how their women were creating new humans, but as they reached out into the world, they began to fear the fact that other people had different skin tone, believed different things. And all of that scared them. All of the possibilities of what this could mean, of how these people could hurt them or whatever, was fear-inducing. And so, of course, slavery was born. Because after all, they learned to control their women. Shouldn't they be able to control anything that was not something they understood? And so it commenced. Though the slavery of the ancient world was not the same as the slavery in the Americas. Because they started with slavery out of merit. Yes, I quote hands that because I don't feel necessarily that this is technically merit, but it's a hell of a lot more merit than our current idea of meritocracy that we are supposedly living here in the States. Merit does not mean my father's pocketbook over your lived experience. So slavery at the time was these people, oh my God, you make me so scared because you're different than me. And you have land that I could use. So instead, I'm going to war with you. I need that land because I say so. You have that land. I don't understand you. So therefore, I have the right to take it by force. And then I'm going to let some of your people stay. But also some of my people have to stay with you to make sure your people are behaving. And then the rest of the people that don't stay, well, they have to come with us. We are going to take a high number of your women so that you can't end up having more humans pop up of your type without our knowledge. They would even make laws for the oppressed and enslaved people to be able to mate or not, and how much and when. It's true. But in this version of slavery, of course, the slaves had rights. We do need to make sure that we are incorporating these people in, even if it is just as our workforce. But we can't incorporate them in if they are afraid that we will hurt them even more. So instead, we're going to make laws against beating your slaves, against raping your slaves, against straight out murdering your slaves, against working your slaves to death. They have the right to a doctor if they're sick, so on and so forth. Yes, of course. Of course. There are always going to be bad actors in these types of things, and there were people who would break these laws. But there were laws in place for repercussions to occur. And just like modern employment laws, masters were not allowed to retaliate against a citizen who happened to be a slave following the law and trying to get justice. And yes, in the ancient world, citizens or slaves were considered citizens. They just weren't considered full 100% citizens. And it wasn't a two-fifths of a person? 2 or 3/5? I don't remember. It wasn't just they were a partial person for like voting and stuff. No. Voting and other such things, they were not considered a person at all. But when it came to their actual humanity, there was empathy there for them. So, when these Caucasians had decided, and by this time, they were intermingled throughout most of Europe and Asia. Well, at least half of Asia. Because, of course, the Orient was still mostly closed off by then. They did not want outsiders in their society. They were willing to trade. They were willing to let outsiders see some of their culture, but certainly never all of at the time. To the point where Bruce Lee, who came over in the 60s, when he brought his martial arts with him, there was much rumblings of whether he should be assassinated or not. And there is still question to this day as to whether he might have been assassinated by people who did not want the American people to know any martial arts whatsoever. There's still that question. So because they have become so widespread, there were so many Caucasians throughout these nations. And of course they weren't all Caucasian, but many people who were Caucasian at the time had decided that the people who looked like them in these countries were the same as them. So of course, the idea of what is white spread past the people who have Caucasian genetics into people who were similar enough. Now, at some point, various different times in most of the cultures of these people, but at some point, they decided their governments were somehow strangling their psychological lifeblood out of them. This happened in multiple countries, of course. Spain, France, all of the United Kingdom has had their troubles with their governments. And so on and so forth, right? So, of course, at that point, there had been new lands discovered. And the various governments, mostly, I believe, patriarchies. Patriarchy in this case meaning a kingdom ran by a king, because a matriarchy is ran by a queen. So most of these governments at the time were engaging in a patriarchal family or royal arrangement. So a lot of them, of course, these royal families and governments were very much the kinds of people who wanted their people to exploit the new lands that had been discovered for resources. But many of the people who wanted to go to these lands were people who wanted to escape what they felt was a strangling government. They came here to the Americas and they found that there were people here already. And, of course, they were warned about this because Christopher Columbus, misunderstanding everything he just did, thought he was in India and named them Indians. We won't get into Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus was a bastard all his own. But, so we came here and we saw a peoples that we viewed as savage. And by we, I don't have any Native American blood. I have Native American family, but no blood. So, we. As a people, we decided that these people were savage. They didn't have the technological base that we did, therefore they were lesser than us. Not white. Must be conquered, not white. And even worse, we wanted what they had, and they wanted to share, but not give us all of it. So of course, we were honor-bound, duty-bound to end the reign of the savages over the land. There was no way they would ever be considered white. Especially while we tried to breed and kill them out. We attempted genocide, almost as severe. Oh, no. We attempted genocide easily as severe as the genocide that has been happening on the Gaza Strip since at least the 70s. That's right, guys. That's the position I hold. And that's the position I've held since I first learned about the plight between the Palestinians and the Israelites in grade school. Because instead of looking at the side that seemed like it looked like me, I looked at both sides. I saw what happened, and I saw who technically should be in the right. And what the best solution was. By the way, they have plenty of room to fucking share. They always have. They have plenty of resources to share. They always have. Anyhow. So we committed genocide. Much, much genocide. There are tribes we might never actually ever know about in the Americas because they were killed off and all of their possessions destroyed before we could even get a chance to meet them. So of course we know the Native Americans are not white. Right? And as we had a policy of trying to end the Native Americans so that we could take everything that we decided they owned, even though many of them routinely kept trying to tell us the resources on these continents are not something you can own, they belong to everyone here, which is the most logical, most sound thinking. So of course, it couldn't be true as far as the Caucasians were concerned. So, of course, since we were breeding them out and killing them off, we had to find some way to not have to do the work that inherently is ours, yet is so hard that God forbid we engage. So of course, We went back to the old countries. We told our leadership, oh, the work is so hard. I could never do all of this by myself. The people we have here are just not enough. We need a workforce. And so those leaderships said, you know what? I hear there's wars happening in the last of the African nations right now. Let's go ahead and we'll take advantage of it. Because, of course, where does slavery come from? It comes from making those who were opposed to me work for my cause. Because I've proven that I am more powerful via war. Sure, this isn't our war. Sure, we're not getting into it, but let's do it anyway. Let's go ahead and buy some of these people and send them that way. And sure enough, they did. So, of course, American slavery began. And unlike the slavery of old, they knew how very far away they were from those who could stop them from breaking the laws that protect the slaves. Laws that kept them from watching their slave be diligent enough in their work to earn their freedom, but then steal them back into slavery again. Laws that kept them from being able to make laws like one-drop laws, which are laws that say if you have just one drop of African blood, you can be legally held in slavery. Which were literally made so that the slave owners who would take their liberties on their slaves could take the products of such liberties and sell them or work them to death or even make them produce more products if they were unfortunate enough to be born female, instead of realizing that this was their own damn child that they were tormenting in this way. These laws kept them from having to even see it. So now we know that Africans from any of the African countries are definitely not white. Of course, in the course of time, slavery became illegal, thanks to the last president we have ever had to represent those in poverty. People who don't live much better than a slave. Sure, they have their own home and they can control where their money goes, but they have no choice but to work for other people to live. Funny enough, it's almost as if that lifestyle has been accepted as the lifestyle we were supposed to live, when it's the opposite. But I digress. So, even as slavery was still abundant in this country, and I'm not talking about the fact that there were still people who did not realize slavery was illegal 20 years after. Not at all. I'm talking about while it was still legal, period. There were already people starting to do things like indentured servitude. Now, of course, indentured servitude sounds pretty, or at least it's a hell of a lot more pretty than slavery, especially considering we know now what slavery turned into, and this was in the thick of that. No. Indentured servitude was a whole new monster of a beast. You see, with slavery, we were on the face calling it what it was. You work for me, and then you get what I give you. Yes, that slavery here in the United States was far, far more egregious, far more abusive than slavery had been in the past before Caucasians came to the shores of the United States in the first place. And of course, this was still while we were a young and budding country. But indentured servitude was slavery nonetheless. You see, the best examples we have of indentured servitude would be bringing over the Oriental peoples. And I say that with an S because if you call the Oriental peoples Asian, you're really, really doing a disservice to all the other Asians who are not Oriental, such as Russians. However, the Oriental peoples, I believe some of the first peoples to come would have been the Japanese and Chinese. I believe people from Indonesia, Korea, Vietnam, places like that were later. I'm talking around the Victorian era or the late 1800s right now. So the Oriental peoples and the Irish from the potato famine, which of course was monocropping with the potato bug, but we'll talk about that some other time. The indentured servitude that they had agreed upon was literally a rich person in the Americas would sponsor, pay for their way to come to the country, and in many cases there would be things added to the bill after this person came to the country. Usually it would be one person who was coming to make money for their family so that they could send it back and or send for their family. Especially if they ended up having a good life here or being able to make a good life here, they would intentionally send for their family. Many of them were unable to make the good life that they wanted to be able to make, so that's kind of a contentious kind of statement, but so there were many of these people who were businessmen who ran businesses who needed employees. So many of these indentured servants would become the employees of these businessmen. Now, if the person who sponsored them was doing this completely and utterly in a healthy, I just wanted to help someone kind of way, or even if they did this as an investment but they still wanted to be a moral human being, what they would do is they would sponsor them to come over to the country. They may help them in way of getting them a place to stay, giving them a small bit of money to start them out while they're beginning. They would give them a small paycheck, and then the rest of that paycheck would go towards the debt. Sometimes go towards the debt plus bills like rent and food to make sure that they were eating and had a place to stay, and that was all going through one source. But in so many cases, what instead happened tended to be things like they come over on the boat. That bill's already tallied up in the ledger. Well, of course, you're going to need a place to stay, so let's find you a place to rent. That rent is added to the bill, of course, especially if you're going to pay it. Then they'll give them a small stipend for, say, clothing, because, you're going to wear that clothing now that you're in the States? And then they would have a stipend for food. Despite how much food might have gotten to the door, they would be charging a certain amount. And in many cases, the amount they charged for all this stuff would be far more than what it actually cost for the person who was sponsoring them. Because, of course, this is an investment, right? I should be making some money off of this person. And in many of these cases, the indentured servant would not see a single dime, let alone a penny, of the money they earned. And in so many more of those cases that happen to go like that, some of these sponsors, I don't know what they called them at the time, but I'm just calling them sponsors now. Some of these sponsors would feign like they actually care about the person, at least a couple times here and there, make you feel like, here's some fresh apples, because I got sick of the apples laying in my yard. But I'm not telling you that. So here's some fresh apples, free on the house, right? Probably fresh apples based on the person's personality, which usually did this kind of thing, probably picked up by their slaves in the first place. So, they would feign like they care. Oh, I am so upset that you've missed your family all these years. We should totally send to bring your wife and children or your parents or whoever you're pining over here. But unfortunately, this time, you don't have the opportunity to research how much it costs for passage this many years later because you're too busy working for this person. I'd say man, because usually it would be a man, but there were a few women who sponsored people to the Americas. So then, of course, because 9 times out of 10, the bill was usually double the actual cost to get the family member over, one can only assume it's you didn't have the time or money to research because I'm working you half to death. And the other half is just you trying to take care of yourself. They would go ahead and flub the numbers towards way too high. That would be added to the bill. And of course, if you have more family members you want to bring over, it's going to have to be added and added and added. Course. Now, there were some people who could wager their way out of it or found ways to work for other people at the same time, the same way some slaves did to earn extra money on the side. Of course. And of course, there were some immigrants that came over with plenty of money and became sponsors, and some of them became the nastier sponsors. Of course. But indentured servitude was just that. It was sponsored slavery. You were indebted to the person who paid your passage until they decided that you paid for the passage. And whatever bills they decided to tack on at the time. Now, that means, of course, that these people who were brought over via indentured servitude, well, they can't be considered white either, could they? So now we've got Native Americans, Africans, Orientals, Irish, probably lump Scottish in there too, because I'm pretty sure the potato famine affected both Irish and Scottish. They both had potato-heavy diets, even though we only really acknowledge it in the Irish. Now, of course, at that point, you might be saying, if the definitely very pale Irish and Scottish people aren't considered white, then what is white? How many other pale peoples are not considered in the wheelhouse of white? Well, as I said before, Originally, white was supposed to mean of Caucasian descent. But it began meaning of affluent influence and pale skin. This is noted by the fact that the Italians, the Norwegians, the French, Swedish, German, Spanish, these are specifically noted in my brain as in historical text being considered people of color, not white. Now, of course, I am a proud human mutt, which means I have many, both Caucasian and non-Caucasian peoples in my genetics. I have a small enough amount of Caucasians that I don't consider myself Caucasian. I don't consider myself white. Legally, I'm African American because of an Egyptian woman who was in the ship of 106 Egyptian slaves, who just happens to be in my genetic line. But I also consider myself ethnically to be a Bohemian Gypsy, which definitely not white, guys. We're pale as hell, but, well, some of us. But definitely not white. No. Because we were the gypsies who did not agree that we should follow other kings, especially when we ourselves were kings from Bohemia. Now, of course, why would I tell you guys how narrow the stage for being white technically is? Because I need to impress upon you guys how very tight and narrow the concept of being white has been for the control of those who are not. You see, when you actually look at what has made a white person throughout history, you see a pattern. Basically, the idea is they teach us that white is right, which is the most ridiculous mindset. That a people or even a person is going to specifically be correct in their behaviors simply because of their skin tone or the fact that they believe that they have the right to control others. I wanted to show you how very narrow that field is, because I guarantee for anyone in the continental United States especially, you have at least 50% of some genetics that has throughout our continental history been considered not white. There is an idea amongst us who are not white that is so very toxic that we can become honorarily white by telling them that they are correct in their thinking, that somehow black people are only, for example, made to be athletes. Yes, this is an example that I've heard from a racist personally. They told me themselves. As galling as that is, people look at me and they think that they have a fellow white person that they can say whatever the hell they want about whatever peoples they want. Of course, I wish they would give me the same consideration when they're shitting on other women, telling me that all women are crazy because of chemicals raging through our body, even though men have those chemicals in the exact same amounts, except for testosterone and estrogen, and in fact, males tend to have more estrogen than females. So they can't give that as an example of why we're chemically crazy either. And males have far more dysregulation in their emotions because they're not taught to use their chemicals correctly. It is galling how many people think that they can just shit on another group of people and have me accept it. Which is why whiteness is such a big problem. You see, there are so many people of color who really believe that whiteness is correct, that we somehow need to figure out a way to become an honorary white person. When the truth is, the kind of white people that they are talking about, not skin tone, but ideology, will never accept them as white. They will always be one of the good ones in the others category. Which is, in complete and utter truth, guys, the reason I made this video. Because you can never, ever, ever be good enough to show a bigot that their beliefs are actually toxic. The best you can do is show a bigot that someone in this group that they hate so much isn't as bad as they say. And by they, I mean the bigot themselves, not society, because so many bigots have the tendency to take what society says and run farther with it. You will never be able to yourself prove to a bigot that your peoples are not bad. Not even if it's just this community of your peoples. So instead of doing so, I invite everyone who would just want to fit into the whiteness of this world and this, especially this country. I invite all of you to take a moment to consider why you would forsake your own people to make a handful of very afraid individuals who let their fear rule how they treat people, somehow think you are better. Why, instead, not help the rest of us? Help those people who let their fear create bigots out of them. Realize that the bigotry is the vile, bile toxin that is killing them from the inside out. And as we embrace their ideologies as okay, it's not only killing them from the inside out, but it is killing our entire world. Even Gaia feels the strain. All right, guys. I kind of rambled a bit more than I wanted to, but there was some points that I wanted to make to kind of bolster the main point a little bit more this time. So I guess this went a little longer than I had hoped, but it's fine, I'm sure. Guys, remember how important it is to actually make sure that you are seeking to understand what you fear, instead of trying to control the thing you fear. Or rather, trying to understand why you fear it is an even better thing to do. I don't want to have to take another take, so we'll just leave that in, guys. Y'all know I like to do this one take. It's so much faster and easier to edit if I do it one take. I have a lot of stuff to do, not only on my computer, but editing, but household-wise as well. So I need that time for the edit to be not so much. Who knows, guys? Maybe I'll get into actually doing some artistic edits again like I did when I first started the channel in the first place. Anyway, I'm going to get out of here, guys. I think I've made my point. A little roundabout as hell. I'm sure I lost a few people who don't have the attention span for it. I'm sure. But hey, if you have trouble with your attention span and you stuck around this long, I just help your attention span grow that nice little bit. Congrats. And with that, guys, again, getting out of here. But, of course, I need you to keep remembering that it doesn't matter who you are. Even if you're a bigot, there is something there that I love you. And to take care of each other. And I'll see you guys in the next video.